The gate exploded open, and 2,000 pounds of pure fury launched into the Houston arena like a missile. Thunder Road twisted his massive frame midair, his hooves barely touching the dirt before he spun violently to the left, exactly as Mike Herrera had expected. What he hadn't expected was the searing pain that shot through his riding arm as the bull rope slipped in his grip during that first devastating buck. Mike Herrera held on with everything he had, his 31-year-old body screaming in protest as Thunder Road became a writhing tornado of muscle and rage beneath him. The crowd of 73,000 erupted in a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of NRG Stadium. Dust clouds swirled around them as the bull's hooves pounded the arena floor with the force of sledgehammers. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. Mike's world had narrowed to nothing but the burning in his lungs and the violent motion threatening to tear him apart. His free arm whipped through the air as he fought to maintain balance, every muscle in his core working overtime to keep him centered on the beast that wanted nothing more than to crush him into the dirt. Thunder Road suddenly changed direction, launching into a series of bone-jarring crow hops that sent shockwaves through Mike's spine. The bull's strategy was becoming clear. Wear down the rider's grip through relentless punishment, then finish him with one of his signature spins that had ended more careers than any other bull in the circuit. 5 seconds. 6 seconds. Mike could feel his grip weakening. The bull rope, slick with sweat and rosin, was beginning to slide through his gloved fingers despite the tight wrap around his hand. Thunder Road sensed it too, the way predators always know when their prey is vulnerable. The massive Brahma cross lowered his head and prepared for his killing move. In the stands, Sarah Herrera pressed her hands to her mouth, her wedding ring catching the arena lights as she watched her husband of 8 years battle for his life. Their daughter Emma had stopped cheering, her small hands clutching her mother's arm as some primitive instinct told her that something was terribly wrong. The usual excitement in the child's eyes had been replaced by a fear she was too young to understand, but old enough to feel. 7 seconds. Almost there. Thunder Road made his move, dropping his shoulder and spinning with a violence that defied physics. Mike felt his body leave the bull's back, his legs flying out as centrifugal force took control. Time seemed to slow as he realized what was happening. He was going down hard, and Thunder Road wasn't finished with him. The crowd's roar transformed into a collective gasp of horror as Mike hit the arena floor with a sickening thud. But Thunder Road, still consumed by rage, wasn't done. The bull wheeled around, his massive head lowered, and charged at the fallen rider with the fury of a freight train. Mike tried to roll away, but his body wouldn't respond the way it should. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His legs felt disconnected, foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. Panic flooded his system as he realized he couldn't move fast enough to escape the approaching storm of hooves and horns. The bullfighters, those brave souls whose job it was to protect fallen riders, rushed into action. Cody Martinez, a 25-year-old from El Paso, threw himself between Mike and the charging bull, waving his colorful shirt and shouting at the top of his lungs. But Thunder Road was locked onto his target, and 2,000 pounds of angry bull doesn't change direction easily. In that split second before impact, Mike's life flashed before his eyes, not in the cliched way people describe, but in vivid, painful detail. He saw Sarah's face on their wedding day, radiant in the Texas sunshine as they exchanged vows at the small church in San Antonio. He remembered the first time he held Emma, how impossibly small and perfect she seemed in his calloused hands. He thought about all the rides he'd made, all the championships he'd chased, all the 8-second battles that had brought him to this moment. Thunder Road's right front hoof caught Mike square in the back as the bull trampled over him. The sound, a wet, crushing noise that every cowboy fears, echoed through the arena, even over the crowd's horrified screams. Mike's world exploded into white-hot agony before mercifully fading to black. The arena fell silent except for the sound of Thunder Road's hooves as the bull continued his rampage around the arena floor. The television cameras, which had been capturing every moment of the action for the live broadcast, suddenly cut away to a commercial as the gravity of the situation became clear. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the rodeo's head medical officer, was already running across the arena floor before Mike had even stopped moving. Behind her came the full medical team, their equipment bags bouncing as they sprinted through the dust and debris. She'd been treating rodeo injuries for 15 years, but something about this one made her stomach clench with dread. "Don't move him," she shouted to the bullfighters who had gathered around Mike's motionless form. "Nobody touches him until we get a neck brace on him." Sarah Herrera was already pushing through the crowd, her mother's instincts overriding every security protocol in the building. She had to get to Mike, had to see for herself that the man she'd loved since she was 19 years old was going to be okay. But the security guards were gentle but firm as they guided her toward the medical area where she could wait for news. The arena had transformed from a place of celebration into something resembling a disaster zone. Paramedics worked with practiced efficiency around Mike's still form, while Dr. Martinez conducted her initial assessment. What she found made her blood run cold. No response to painful stimuli below the waist, no reflexes in the lower extremities, and most terrifying of all, no sensation when she tested his legs with a sharp instrument. "We need to get him to Memorial Hermann Trauma Center immediately," she called out to her team. "Possible spinal cord injury, priority 1 transport." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Mike was carefully loaded onto a backboard and then onto a stretcher. The man who had walked into the arena just minutes before as one of the top bull riders in the world was now being wheeled out as medical personnel worked frantically to stabilize him for transport. As the ambulance pulled away from NRG Stadium, its red and blue lights cutting through the Houston night, no one could have imagined that those 8 seconds on Thunder Road would mark the end of more than just Mike Herrera's riding career. They would test everything he thought he knew about himself, challenge every relationship he held dear, and force him to discover whether the spirit that had made him a champion could survive when the body that had carried him to glory could no longer answer the call. The Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo continued, as these events always do, but the shadow of what had happened hung over the arena like a storm cloud. In the medical tent, Sarah Herrera clutched her daughter's hand and waited for news that would change their lives forever. Thunder Road had won this battle in the most devastating way possible, but the war for Mike Herrera's future was just beginning. The fluorescent lights of Memorial Hermann Hospital's trauma center cast everything in harsh, unforgiving clarity. Sarah Herrera sat in the waiting room, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Emma slept fitfully in the chair beside her, her small body curled up under Mike's rodeo jacket that still smelled of leather and arena dust. It had been 6 hours since the accident, and the waiting was killing Sarah more than any physical pain ever could. Carlos Mendoza paced the linoleum floor like a caged animal, his boots clicking against the tiles with each turn. He'd been Mike's traveling partner for 8 years, had seen him take countless hard falls and walk away from all of them. This was different, though. The way Mike had hit the ground, the way his body had looked when Thunder Road's hoof connected. Carlos had known immediately that their lives had just changed forever. "Mrs. Herrera?" Dr. James Fletcher emerged from the treatment area, his surgical scrubs still bearing traces of blood. He was a tall man in his 50s, with graying temples and the kind of steady demeanor that came from delivering both miracles and devastation to families for over 2 decades. His expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah had been a nurse before Emma was born, and she could read the subtle signs that told her everything she needed to know. "How is he?" Sarah stood up so quickly that the coffee cup slipped from her hands, shattering against the floor in a spray of ceramic and cold liquid. She didn't even notice. Dr. Fletcher gestured toward a small consultation room off the main waiting area. "Let's sit down and talk." Those 5 words hit Sarah like a physical blow. In her nursing experience, doctors only said, "Let's sit down and talk," when the news was too heavy to deliver standing up. She scooped up Emma, who had awakened at the sound of the breaking cup, and followed Dr. Fletcher into the room with Carlos close behind. The consultation room was designed to be comforting, soft lighting, neutral colors, a box of tissues strategically placed on the small table between the chairs. But nothing could soften what Dr. Fletcher had to say. "Mike is stable," he began, and Sarah felt a momentary surge of relief before he continued. "However, the injury to his spinal cord is severe. The impact from the bull caused a complete fracture dislocation of his T12 vertebra. That's the lower portion of his thoracic spine. We've completed surgery to stabilize the fracture and relieve pressure on the spinal cord, but..." The word "but" hung in the air like a death sentence. "The damage to the spinal cord itself is extensive. Based on our initial neurological assessments and the MRI findings, Mike has what we classify as a complete spinal cord injury at the T12 level. This means he has no sensation or voluntary motor function below the point of injury." Sarah's world tilted on its axis. She heard the words, understood their clinical meaning, but her mind refused to process what they meant for Mike, for their family, for the future they'd planned together. "Are you saying he's paralyzed?" The word felt foreign in her mouth, like she was speaking a language she'd never learned. "Yes," Dr. Fletcher said gently. "Mike will never walk again. He'll never regain function in his legs. The injury is permanent." Emma, who had been quietly listening despite being only 6 years old, looked up at her mother with confused eyes. "Is Daddy going to be okay?" The question that should have had a simple answer suddenly became impossibly complex. Was Mike going to be okay? How do you explain to a 6-year-old that her father, who had always been larger than life, invincible in her eyes, would now spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair? Carlos, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "What about experimental treatments? Stem cell therapy? I've read about people walking again after injuries like this." Dr. Fletcher's expression remained compassionate, but firm. "I understand the desire to explore every option, and will certainly discuss rehabilitation and adaptive technologies that can help Mike live a full life. But I need to be clear about the reality of his injury. With a complete T12 injury, the likelihood of recovery of motor function is essentially zero. The sooner we can help Mike and your family accept this reality, the sooner we can focus on helping him build a new life." Sarah felt something inside her chest crack, like ice breaking on a frozen pond. This couldn't be happening. Mike was supposed to be invincible. He'd survived hundreds of rides on bulls that had sent other cowboys to the hospital. He'd walked away from wrecks that should have killed him. How could 8 seconds change everything? "When can I see him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's awake now, though he's still heavily medicated for pain. I should warn you, he's been asking about his legs, about when he'll be able to walk again. We haven't told him the full extent of his injuries yet. We wanted you to be there when we have that conversation." The walk to Mike's room felt like the longest journey of Sarah's life. The ICU was a maze of beeping machines and hushed conversations, where hope and despair lived side by side in equal measure. When she finally reached room 314, she paused outside the door, trying to prepare herself for what she was about to see. Mike lay propped up in the hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting him to an array of monitors that tracked every heartbeat, every breath. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were alert and focused on the ceiling tiles above him. When he heard footsteps, he turned his head toward the door, and his face lit up with the smile that had first captured Sarah's heart 13 years ago. "Hey, beautiful," he said, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd only recently removed. "Come here and give me a kiss. I've been asking these nurses to call you, but they said you were already here." Sarah felt tears she didn't know she'd been holding back spill down her cheeks as she approached the bed. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, tasting the salt of her own tears. "How are you feeling?" she asked, though the question seemed inadequate for everything she wanted to know. "Like I got run over by a freight train," Mike said with a weak laugh. "But hey, I almost made 8 seconds on Thunder Road. That's something, right?" He tried to shift his position in the bed and frowned. "My legs are really numb, though. Must be the pain medication. Doc says I'll be back on my feet in no time." Sarah's heart shattered as she realized that Mike had no idea what had really happened to him. In his mind, this was just another injury, another obstacle to overcome before getting back to the life he'd always known. The truth was going to destroy him. Dr. Fletcher entered the room quietly, followed by Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's chief neurologist. Sarah could see in their faces that the moment of truth had arrived. "Mike," Dr. Fletcher said, pulling a chair up beside the bed. "We need to talk about your injuries and what they mean for your recovery." Mike's expression grew serious, but there was still optimism in his eyes. "Lay it on me, document. How long before I can get back in the arena?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah watched as the hope slowly drained from her husband's face, replaced by a growing understanding of what that silence meant. "Mike," Dr. Williams said gently, "the injury to your spinal cord was severe. The vertebra at T12 was completely fractured, and the damage to the cord itself is extensive. We've done everything surgically that we can do, but..." "But what?" Mike's voice had changed, becoming harder, more defensive. "You're going to be paralyzed from the waist down, Mike. Permanently. You'll never walk again." The words hit the room like a bomb blast. Sarah watched as every emotion she'd ever seen cross her husband's face played out in fast forward. Disbelief, anger, denial, and finally, a crushing despair that made her want to gather him in her arms and somehow take his pain into herself. "No," Mike said flatly. "No, that's not. I can feel my legs. They're numb, but I can feel them." Dr. Williams gently lifted the sheet covering Mike's legs and took out a small, sharp instrument. "Mike, I want you to tell me when you feel this." She began testing different areas of his legs and feet, but Mike's face remained unchanged. "I don't understand," he said, his voice beginning to crack. "I can see you touching me. Why can't I feel it?" The next few minutes were torture as the doctors explained the nature of spinal cord injuries, the difference between complete and incomplete injuries, and what Mike's specific diagnosis meant for his future. With each technical term, each clinical explanation, Sarah watched her husband disappear further into himself. When the doctors finally left, promising to return later to discuss rehabilitation options, Mike turned his head away from Sarah and stared out the window at the Houston skyline. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Mike," Sarah said softly, reaching for his hand. "We're going to get through this. Together." He didn't respond for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, empty of all the warmth and strength she'd grown to depend on. "I'm not a cowboy anymore," he said. "I'm not anything anymore." Sarah squeezed his hand tighter, feeling the calluses on his palm that came from years of gripping bull ropes. "You're my husband. You're Emma's father. You're still Mike Herrera, and that's never going to change." But even as she said the words, Sarah wondered if they were true. The man lying in this hospital bed looked like her husband, sounded like him, but something essential had been broken along with his spine. The question that would haunt them both in the weeks to come was whether that something could ever be repaired. Outside the window, the city of Houston continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in room 314 of Memorial Hermann Hospital, a family was beginning to learn what it meant to rebuild a life from the ground up. If this story is already affecting you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories. 3 months after the accident, Mike Herrera sat in his wheelchair in the driveway of their modest ranch house in San Antonio, staring at the wooden ramp that Carlos and a group of local cowboys had built in place of the front steps. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his entire adult life trying to stay on top of things that wanted to throw him off, and now he needed a ramp just to get into his own home. The Texas heat was already oppressive at 9 in the morning, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he gripped the wheels of his chair. Physical therapy had taught him the mechanics of wheelchair mobility, but the emotional weight of it still felt crushing. Every movement was a reminder of what he'd lost, every push forward a monument to the life that had been taken from him in 8 seconds on a bull named Thunder Road. "You coming in for breakfast?" Sarah called from the front door, her voice carrying that forced cheerfulness that had become as much a part of their daily routine as his morning medications. She was trying so hard to maintain normalcy, but Mike could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached them anymore. "In a minute," he replied, though they both knew he'd been saying that for the past hour. The truth was, Mike was terrified of going inside. The house had been modified to accommodate his wheelchair, doorways widened, bathroom renovated, a hospital bed installed in what used to be the guest room because the stairs to their bedroom might as well have been Mount Everest now. But every adaptation was a slap in the face, a reminder of his new limitations. Emma appeared in the doorway beside her mother, her small face serious in a way that broke Mike's heart. At 6 years old, she was trying to understand why her daddy was different now, why he couldn't pick her up and spin her around like he used to, why he got angry at things that never bothered him before. "Daddy, can you help me with my boots?" she asked, holding up her tiny cowboy boots that Mike had bought her for her last birthday. They were just like his, or rather, just like the ones that now sat unused in the closet. The simple request hit him like a physical blow. Before the accident, helping Emma with her boots had been a daily ritual, a small moment of connection between father and daughter. Now, even that simple task felt impossibly complicated. How do you help a child with her boots when you can't feel your own feet? "Ask Mommy to help you, sweetheart," he said, hating the way his voice sounded. Tired, defeated, nothing like the strong father she deserved. Emma's face fell, and she looked between her parents with the confusion of a child trying to understand why the world had suddenly become so complicated. Sarah knelt down and helped her with the boots, but Mike could see the hurt in their daughter's eyes, the way she kept glancing at him as if she'd done something wrong. Dr. Patricia Williams had warned him about this during one of their sessions at the rehabilitation hospital. Depression after spinal cord injury was common, she'd said, almost inevitable. The grieving process for the loss of mobility could be as intense as grieving a death, because in many ways that's exactly what it was, the death of the person you used to be. The sound of a pickup truck pulling into the driveway broke through Mike's dark thoughts. Carlos climbed out of his battered Ford, moving with the careful gait of a man whose body had absorbed too many hits over the years. Behind him came Jake Morrison, a bull rider Mike had known since they were both teenagers starting out on the amateur circuit. "Morning, Mike," Carlos said, his tone carefully casual as he approached the wheelchair. "Figured we'd stop by, see how you're doing." Mike wanted to tell them he was doing fine, that everything was great, that they didn't need to waste their time checking on the broken-down has-been in the wheelchair. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just nodded and tried to summon the energy to care about whatever brought them here. Jake shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with what to say. Mike had seen that look before. It was the same expression people got when they encountered something they didn't understand, something that made them confront their own mortality. He'd become a living reminder of how quickly everything could change, how fragile the line was between ability and disability. "We've been talking," Carlos said, pulling up a lawn chair to sit at Mike's eye level. It was a small gesture, but Mike appreciated it. Most people either towered over him now or awkwardly squatted down like they were talking to a child. "About maybe getting you back involved with the circuit." Mike felt a bitter laugh escape his throat. "What, as a mascot?" "The cautionary tale they will out to scare the rookies." "As a coach," Jake said firmly. "There's a lot of young riders coming up who could use someone with your experience. Someone who understands what it takes to compete at the highest level." The suggestion should have been flattering, but instead it felt like salt in a wound. Mike had no interest in watching other people do what he could never do again, in being constantly reminded of what he'd lost. The very thought of being around the arena, smelling the leather and dirt and sweat, hearing the crowd roar for someone else's 8 seconds. It was too much. "I'm not ready for that," he said quietly. Carlos leaned forward in his chair. "Mike, I get it. This is the hardest thing you'll ever go through. But hiding out here isn't going to change what happened. You're still Mike Herrera. That doesn't go away just because you're in a wheelchair. Doesn't it?" Mike's voice was sharper than he intended. "Because last I checked, Mike Herrera was a bull rider. That was my identity, my purpose, everything I was good at. Now I'm just..." He gestured at himself with disgust. "This." The silence that followed was painful. Sarah had come out onto the porch and was listening from the doorway. Emma pressed against her side. Mike hated that his daughter had to hear him like this, but he couldn't seem to stop the words from coming. "You know what the worst part is?" he continued, his voice cracking. "It's not the wheelchair. It's not even the fact that I'll never walk again. It's that everyone looks at me like I'm already dead. Like the Mike Herrera they knew died in that arena. And this is just some sad leftover that nobody knows what to do with." Jake stood up abruptly and walked a few steps away before turning back. When he spoke, his voice was tight with emotion. "You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see the guy who taught me how to wrap a bull rope properly when I was 17 years old. I see the man who talked me through my first really bad wreck, who told me that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about being afraid and doing it anyway. I see someone who spent 12 years proving that heart matters more than size or strength or any other damn thing in this sport." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "You're right that Mike Herrera the bull rider is gone. But Mike Herrera the man, the husband, the father, the friend, he's sitting right here in front of us. And maybe it's time you figured out what that version of yourself is capable of." The words hit Mike harder than any bull had ever hit him. For the first time since the accident, he felt something other than despair. A tiny spark of something that might have been hope, or at least curiosity about what his life could become if he stopped mourning what it used to be. Emma suddenly broke away from Sarah and ran down the ramp to her father's wheelchair. Without saying a word, she climbed into his lap and wrapped her small arms around his neck. Mike held her tight, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, and for a moment the weight of his new reality seemed a little lighter. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered in his ear. "Even if you're different now." The simple acceptance in her voice broke something open in Mike's chest. Children had a way of cutting through all the complicated emotions and getting straight to the truth. He was different now, irrevocably changed, but he was still her father. He was still Sarah's husband. He was still himself, just in a form he didn't recognize yet. "I love you too, baby girl," he whispered back, his voice thick with tears he'd been holding back for months. Later that evening, after Carlos and Jake had left and Emma was in bed, Mike sat with Sarah on the back porch watching the sun set over the Texas hill country. The ramp might have been necessary, but the view from their porch was the same as it had always been. Rolling hills dotted with oak trees, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink that took his breath away. "Jake was right, you know," Sarah said softly, her hand resting on his arm. "About figuring out what this version of yourself can do." Mike nodded slowly. "I'm scared, Sarah. I'm scared that this is all I'll ever be, angry and bitter, and taking it out on everyone who tries to help. I'm scared that Emma will remember me like this instead of how I used to be. Then let's figure out how to be different, she said. Together. One day at a time. For the first time in 3 months, Mike felt like maybe, just maybe, there might be a future worth fighting for. It wouldn't be the future he'd planned, but that didn't mean it couldn't be meaningful. The cowboy in him might be gone, but perhaps there was something else waiting to be discovered, some new way to matter in the world. The road ahead would be long and difficult, full of challenges he couldn't even imagine yet. But as he sat there with his wife's hand in his, watching the sun set over the land he'd always called home, Mike Herrera began to believe that maybe he could learn how to live again. Even if he had to learn how to fall first. 1 year after the accident, Mike Herrera wheeled himself into the familiar chaos of the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. The sounds and smells hit him like a physical force, leather creaking, bulls snorting, the distant roar of the crowd mixed with country music and the smell of barbecue smoke. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair tighter as memories of that night 12 months ago flooded back with painful clarity. Sarah walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder in a gesture that had become second nature over the past year. Emma skipped ahead of them, wearing her miniature cowboy hat and a shirt that read, "My dad is my hero." The sight of his daughter's unquestioning acceptance still amazed Mike. She'd adapted to his wheelchair faster than any of them, treating it not as a symbol of limitation, but simply as a part of who her father was now. "You sure you're ready for this?" Sarah asked quietly, though they both knew he'd been working toward this moment for months. Mike nodded, though his stomach was churning with nerves he hadn't felt since his rookie year. "Ready as I'll ever be." The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After Jake's visit that morning in the driveway, Mike had spent weeks in the dark place that Dr. Williams had warned him about, the valley of despair that every spinal cord injury patient had to cross. There had been days when he couldn't get out of bed, nights when Sarah found him crying in his wheelchair in the living room, mornings when Emma's innocent questions about why Daddy seemed so sad cut through him like knives. But slowly, painfully, he'd begun to climb out of that valley. It started with small things, agreeing to see the sports psychologist Dr. Williams recommended, attending a support group for spinal cord injury patients, and eventually accepting Carlos's invitation to visit a local youth rodeo as a spectator. That first trip back to an arena had been torture. Every cowboy he saw reminded him of what he'd lost. Every ride was a painful echo of his former life. But something unexpected happened as he watched those young riders. Kids barely out of high school with more courage than common sense, just like he'd been once. He found himself analyzing their form, noticing technical mistakes, seeing potential that needed guidance. When a 16-year-old kid named Tommy Rodriguez got thrown hard and came up limping, Mike had rolled his wheelchair over to check on him. The conversation that followed changed everything. "You're Mike Herrera," Tommy had said, his eyes wide with recognition despite the pain in his ribs. "I've watched videos of your rides 100 times. That ride on Devil's Backbone in Fort Worth, man, that was legendary." Mike had expected the usual pity, the careful words people used around him now. Instead, he found a kid who didn't see a broken-down former cowboy in a wheelchair, but a mentor whose experience could make the difference between a good rider and a great one. "Your left shoulder drops about 2 inches before the gate opens," Mike had told him. "Bull can feel that shift in weight. You're telegraphing your nerves." The simple observation led to a 30-minute conversation about technique, mental preparation, and the subtle adjustments that separated the champions from the also-rans. When Tommy's next ride stayed on for the full 8 seconds and won the event, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced since before the accident: purpose. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit rodeo community that Mike Herrera was working with young riders. What started as casual conversations at local events evolved into formal coaching sessions. Mike discovered that his years of experience, his ability to read both bulls and riders, hadn't disappeared with his ability to walk. If anything, being forced to analyze rather than perform had sharpened his eye for the subtle details that made the difference between success and failure. Now, 12 months after Thunder Road had ended his riding career, Mike was returning to the Houston Rodeo not as a competitor, but as something entirely new: a coach whose students had qualified for the biggest stage in professional rodeo. The backstage area buzzed with familiar energy, but Mike's perspective had changed completely. Instead of preparing for his own ride, he was focused on the 3 young cowboys he'd been working with for the past 6 months. Tommy Rodriguez had developed into a legitimate championship contender. Marcus Williams, a 19-year-old from East Texas, had overcome a crippling fear of bulls to become one of the most technically sound riders Mike had ever seen. And David Chun, a college student whose parents thought he was crazy for choosing rodeo over medical school, had the kind of natural balance that couldn't be taught. "Coach, I'm nervous as hell," Tommy said, approaching Mike's wheelchair with the wide-eyed look of a rider facing his first major rodeo. "This is Houston. This is the big leagues." Mike smiled, remembering his own first time at this rodeo 20 years ago. "Good. Nervous means you care. The day you stop being nervous is the day you should quit. But don't let the nerves control you, use them. That energy you're feeling? Channel it into focus." He gathered his 3 riders around him, creating an island of calm in the chaotic backstage area. Other cowboys nodded respectfully as they passed. Mike's reputation as a coach was already spreading through the circuit, and his students' success spoke for itself. "Remember what we've worked on," Mike said, his voice carrying the authority of 12 years of professional competition. "Tommy, keep that left shoulder steady. Marcus, don't overthink it. Trust your instincts. David, stay relaxed through the first 2 seconds. The bull will show you what kind of ride it's going to be." As the rodeo began, Mike positioned himself near the chutes where he could see everything and communicate with his riders. Sarah and Emma found seats in the stands, but Mike knew he needed to be down here, in the thick of the action, where he could make a difference. The first bull rider out of the chutes was a veteran from Oklahoma who made it look easy, scoring an 87 that would be hard to beat. The second rider got hung up in his rope and had to be rescued by the bullfighters. The third bucked off in less than 4 seconds. Then Tommy Rodriguez's name echoed through the arena speakers. Mike watched his young protege settle onto the back of a bull called Tornado Alley, a Black Angus cross known for his quick spins and high kicks. Tommy's face was set in concentration as he wrapped the bull rope around his gloved hand, every movement precise and controlled in the way Mike had drilled into him over countless practice sessions. "Rider ready," called the gate man. Tommy adjusted his hat, took a deep breath, and nodded. The gate exploded open and Tornado Alley lived up to his reputation, launching into a series of violent spins that would have sent most riders flying. But Tommy stayed centered, his free arm working for balance, his legs in perfect position as the bull tried every trick in his arsenal. Mike found himself gripping the armrests of his wheelchair, counting off the seconds in his head. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. 6 seconds. Tornado Alley changed tactics, straightening out, and then launching into a series of crow hops that rattled teeth and tested vertebrae. But Tommy absorbed the punishment, riding the rhythm instead of fighting it, staying fluid and balanced as the clock ticked toward 8. 7 seconds. 8 seconds. The horn sounded and Tommy dismounted cleanly, landing on his feet and raising his arms in triumph as the crowd erupted in applause. When the score flashed on the arena board, 89 points, good enough for the lead, Mike felt tears streaming down his face. Not tears of sadness or self-pity, but tears of pure joy and pride. He'd helped create that ride. His knowledge, his experience, his ability to see what others missed had been passed on to a young cowboy who'd just achieved his dream on the biggest stage in rodeo. Marcus and David both rode well that night, finishing in the top 10 out of 40 riders. But it was Tommy's victory that meant the most to Mike. As his student climbed into the stands to celebrate with his family, he made a detour to where Mike was sitting. "Thank you, Coach," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Mike shook the young man's hand, feeling the calluses that came from gripping bull ropes, and knowing that some part of his legacy would continue through riders like this one. "You did the hard part, Tommy. You got on the bull and stayed on for 8 seconds. That's all anybody can ask for." As the rodeo wound down and the arena began to empty, Mike sat quietly in his wheelchair, processing what had just happened. For months, he'd struggled with the question of who he was if he wasn't Mike Herrera, the bull rider. Tonight, he had his answer. He was Mike Herrera, the coach, the mentor, the man who could take young cowboys with raw talent and help them achieve their dreams. He was still connected to the sport he loved, still making a difference, still mattering in ways he'd never imagined when he was focused solely on his own success. Sarah and Emma made their way down from the stands, Emma practically bouncing with excitement. "Daddy, that was so cool. Did you see Tommy win? Did you see how he stayed on that bull?" "I saw it, baby girl," Mike said, lifting her into his lap. "And you know what? We helped make that happen." Sarah leaned down and kissed him, her eyes bright with tears of pride. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. You found your way back. As they made their way out of the arena, Mike reflected on the long journey from that night when Thunder Road had changed everything. The path had been darker and more difficult than anything he'd ever imagined, full of pain and despair and moments when giving up seemed like the only option. But he'd learned something important in those dark months, that sometimes falling was just the first step in learning how to rise. The Mike Herrera who rode bulls was gone forever, but in his place had emerged someone perhaps even more valuable. A man who understood that true strength wasn't about staying on top of a bull for 8 seconds, but about getting back up every time life knocked you down. The cowboy might be gone, but the spirit that made him a cowboy, the courage, the determination, the refusal to quit, lived on in a new form. And maybe, Mike thought as he wheeled through the Houston night with his family beside him, that was the most important 8 seconds of all. In the end, Thunder Road hadn't defeated him. It had simply forced him to discover who he really was beneath the chaps and spurs and championship belt buckles. And what he'd found was a man worth being proud of, wheelchair and all. If this story has moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories.